Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. Mark Twain once said that many people worry about the parts of the Bible they don't understand. He then went on to comment, "There is plenty of parts I do understand to trouble me." Well, that may be true for many of us as we recognize the many ways we fail to follow the Bible well. Nevertheless, it seems to me that there's something fairly significant in the Bible that most of us have only a vague understanding of. But most of the time, we simply pass it by and don't give it much thought. As we read the Gospels over and over, we read about Jesus encountering Pharisees, Sadducees, zealots, priests, scribes, and more. But most of us don't have a clear understanding of who made up these groups and what they stood for. Sometimes to understand what Jesus is saying, it helps to know who he is saying it to. So my plan for this week is to introduce us to some of those groups who were active in the time of Jesus. Today we want to start the week off with the group you have probably heard about the most, the Pharisees. In some ways, it may be that the Pharisees have an undeserved reputation. We likely have some idea that they were constantly squabbling with Jesus, and that gives us the impression that Jesus didn't like Pharisees very much. Actually, it's true that they squabble with Jesus a good bit, but the nature of the dispute is more like that of a parent with a child who gets B pluses without studying. The parent is likely to fuss that with just a little change, just a little study, the child could be getting A's. Jesus and the Pharisees seem a bit like that. Jesus seems to fuss because the Pharisees are so close to what they should be, and they just need to get over their legalism and letter of the law focus, and instead focus on the spirit of the law, and then they would be at the center of God's heart. So the sense is that in actuality, Jesus and the Pharisees were pretty close together in most circumstances. The Pharisees were a social and religious movement during the time of the Second Temple, from about 500 BC until that temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. The Pharisees were interested in adapting to the Greek culture, and that put them at odds with the Sadducees, who were not. And we will dig into the Sadducees more tomorrow. Probably even more significantly, it seems that the Pharisees were open to the whole tradition of Jewish law, like the writings and the prophets, while the Sadducees were sticklers for the Torah, only the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The origin of the Pharisees seems to be during the exile in Babylon. While they were in Babylon and their temple and homeland had been destroyed, the Jews began meeting for worship and study in private homes. When they went back to Israel, these houses continued, and the leaders of these houses became the Pharisees. They were the equivalent of devout lay people who were leaders, and eventually these houses of worship and study became known as synagogues. Over time, the Pharisees were considered the most expert and accurate expositors of Jewish law and received the backing and goodwill of the common people. The Pharisees were devout monotheists, espousing that there was only one God. One of their most significant prayers was called the Shema, which comes from Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, which begins with the verses, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Another important distinction among the Pharisees is their view of free will. According to Josephus, an early historian, while the Sadducees believed that people had total free will, and the Essenes believed that all of a person's life was predestined, the Pharisees believed that people have free will, but that God also has foreknowledge of human destiny. I suspect that many of us would agree with the Pharisees on this one. Another of their key beliefs that distinguished them is that the Pharisees believed in life after death, while some other groups did not. Again, we will talk more about that tomorrow. Basically, the Pharisees continued a form of Judaism that extended beyond the temple, applying Jewish law to mundane activities in order to sanctify the everyday world. Faith wasn't confined to worship. It involved everyday life. There are several significant Pharisees mentioned in the Gospels and in Acts. Nicodemus was a Pharisee who likely believed in Jesus, as was Joseph of Arimathea, who took Jesus' body from the cross and laid it in a tomb. St. Paul was a Pharisee and considered himself one even after he believed in Jesus. And Paul studied under a Pharisee named Gamaliel, who is mentioned advising that Jesus' followers be treated carefully. When the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, the Pharisees were the only religious leadership left in the land. And so the Judaism that has come to us today is descended directly from them. Jewish rabbis and worship in synagogues come from this tradition still today. Now, there's a lot more to learn about this group of believers, and I encourage you to Google them and to learn more. They often seem at odds with Jesus, but in truth, there is much good there too. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.